bop bop, beep bop beep bop beep, beep bop beep bop bop, beep bop beep bop beep, beep bop beep bop bop, beep bop beep bop beep, beep bop beep bop bop, beep bop beep bop beep bop boop bop boop, beep bop boop. Hey folks, you're probably wondering, Matt, what's with the hat? Well, on to the next episode of Matt Mangles McCartney. And I thought the hat was appropriate because we're going down home. We're going back to the country. We're going to get back to the farm. We're going to see wildlife. Yes, that's right, wildlife. December 1971. I kind of consider it Paul's 1972 album because it came out so late in the year. But where did our story leave off? Okay, so it was December of 71, and I had gotten the Ram album for Christmas, if you remember. That was a big year for me with Ram. Hope you're watching these videos in succession. We'll continue the story. So I got Ram, and I have to tell you, moving on now to wildlife, I kind of missed this album, folks. It kind of got by me. It's kind of that lost Paul album that just kind of slipped away in the beginning anyway, and I'll tell you about that. So I got Ram for Christmas of 71, so I was heavily into Ram coming into 1972. During 1972, I was very, very big into my Beatles collecting. I was going mad just looking for every Beatle album I could, trying to get every record I could, every song. You know, you got to figure, I was 10 years old, going on 11 when 1972 kicked in. And so I was still in the throes of Beatlemania. Had a couple of Paul albums, had McCartney, had Ram, but this one got away. All right. Now, early in the year, I did hear Mary Had a Little Lamb. I don't know where I heard it, and it had to be on the radio. I assume it was played on the radio, and that was in the spring of 72 or so. And I liked it. I thought, I was a 10-year-old. I thought it was a cute little song, and I thought it was good. You're talking about somebody who thought Ding Dong the Witch is Dead by the Fifth Estate was heavy rock, So I had that 45 of Ding Dong the Witch is Dead. So having Mary Had a Little Lamb on the radio was like cool to me. I thought it was just fine. So I had heard Mary Had a Little Lamb, but I didn't get the single, just hearing it on the periphery on the radio and whatnot. So what happens next is, it's October 1972. I still have no idea about this album. And let's reiterate, I still have not had official confirmation that the Beatles are no more. That's right. If you watched the last two videos you saw, I was kind of in I don't want to say a denial mode because I never really heard that they had broken up. I just didn't understand why Paul had some albums out with just his image on it and he was just the only one on them. But I just assumed the Beatles were just on a hiatus or, they're coming back or whatever. When you're 9, 10, 11 years old, you don't really think deeply about such things. You know what I mean? So we're going into October 72 now, and I still have not gotten confirmation about the Beatles breakup. Crazy, I know, over 2 years since they had officially called it quits. So I'm over my grandmother and grandfather's house. And you got to understand my grandmother and grandfather, they were from the old country, Italians, came over first. They were the first generation that came here in the early 20th century, Ellis Island, the whole thing. And they lived in a house which they had lived in for most of their married life in Providence, Rhode Island. And they had my grandfather was a carpenter, my grandmother was a great cook and a baker and all that stuff. But one of their joys in life, and which was like an amazing invention to them, was the television, okay? They thought TV was great. They loved watching TV shows, the Sanford and Son, All in the Family, Lawrence Welk, all that good stuff that generation enjoyed. But one night I'm over their house with a couple of the cousins, the older cousins I've talked about in past Matt Mangles McCartney videos, and they were watching the Flip Wilson show. Like I said, fall, October 1972. So I had a little spot on the floor. I would sit leaning against a chair watching TV with my grandparents when we were over there, or they were watching us, whatever. And all of a sudden, Flip Wilson's special guest that night, now I didn't know at the time it was via videotape or tape, but it was Paul McCartney and Wings, and they did Mary Had a Little Lamb. My cousins were there. We all were engrossed by it. I thought, if you've never seen that video, to my young 10-year-old eyes, no, I was 11 by that point. My 11-year-old eyes, I thought it was the greatest video. I just thought it was so otherworldly, and if you watch that video, like the effects on it are very cheesy today, but back then in 1972 it seemed kind of cool, like, ooh, wow, So I saw the Mary Had a Little Lamb video, thought it was the greatest thing, liked the song, and I remember going to my cousin, or asking my cousin, I said, well, where are the Beatles? How come it, how come he's doing it with these other people? I had no clue. And that's when my cousin, my middle cousin, I believe it was, blurted out to me and said, don't you know, the Beatles broke up. The Beatles aren't together anymore. They broke up a while ago. And talk about taking the wind out of my sails, folks. I was just like it just hit me then. Like I wasn't devastated in the sense like I was ready to have an emotional breakdown or anything. I just felt a load of sadness, of disappointment. Like, really? The Beatles aren't together anymore? It just struck me like, wow, like that's sad. It bummed me out, And that's when I first got confirmation that the Beatles were no more. Watching the Flip Wilson show, 1972, and seeing Paul doing Mary Had a Little Lamb. I finally figured it out. They had broken up. They were all done. Now, I do remember later in that year also hearing Hi, 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 which was a single recorded around this time on the radio, and I remember liking it. It was a rocker. I didn't understand the Hi, Hi, Hi and the lyrics to it. I didn't get all that then or what. I just thought it was a cool little upbeat rock and roll song from Paul, and I liked it. But they had broken up. Sad to say, and I was sad to hear that news on that night. But I gotta say, let's go back to the Wildlife album now. I've been yabbering on here, but let's get to Wildlife. Folks, I have to be honest with you. I didn't get this album till probably around 1976. I'm being honest. I might have heard dribs and drabs of it. I might have rented it at the library once when I was a kid, like a young teenager, 13 or 14. But I didn't get the album till the mid-70s. And that's because, folks, this album, let me go back to my feelings of it back then. I would have much rather, back in those days, put on McCartney or Ram or the two that came after this, which was Red Rose Speedway, which will be my next episode, or Band on the Run. Out of the first 5 Paul albums, this is probably, at the time, was my least favorite. I had no really connection to it or interest in it. Does that make sense? I didn't have that urgency to listen to this album. It just didn't. I don't know what it was, but it just never hit me when it first came out, or I was never aware of it when it first came out. By the time I became aware of it and listened to it a little bit, I didn't really, not hate it, but I didn't really care for it. It just wasn't, to me, like I said, I'd rather go back to those other 4 albums before I'd ever go to this one. It wasn't until I got it, and finally, I said, around 1976, that I finally started to get it. I started to understand the joy of this album and became a fan of it. And it took years to really build up to the point where I can stand here now in 2020 and tell you, during the 90s, I had a good friend of mine who was my Beatles friend. He's passed away since, but his name was Larry. And during the 90s, we dove into this album. I mean, among millions of albums. But finally in the 90s, I really got into Wildlife and started to really love it and enjoy it and cherish it. And that did finally happen. Like I said, it took till the 90s for that to happen, but I finally grew a big appreciation to it, to the point that I think this is a fine album. I really love it. And the song that always stuck out for me was, obviously, for me anyway, was Some People Never Know. That's probably my favorite song on the album. Love that song. I think it's a Paul McCartney classic. I'll always love that song. And, looking at it now, the 8 songs, I really do enjoy it. It's not a song where I want to hear, like, Wildlife just off by itself, or I want to hear Mumbo, just put it on. I like to listen to this entire album together as one piece. That's the way I enjoy it. I'll put it on, Mumbo comes on, get into the groove of Mumbo, then Bip Bop comes in, Love is Strange with the reggae beat to it, Wildlife, Some People Never Know, I Am Your Singer, Tomorrow, and Dear Friend. When I listen to it as a complete piece, just sitting back, relaxed, and I just did last night, as a matter of fact, I really enjoy and love this album and consider it one of Paul's finest. I really do. Now, would it rank in my top 10 of Paul's albums of all time? I don't think it did when I did my list a couple of years ago, but I love all of Paul's albums in some way. There's 2 or 3 we'll get to eventually that are kind of shaky for me. But for the most part, Paul's catalog, I love his albums. And so this one has really grown on me over the years. It was a slow burn. I didn't get it, like I said, till around 76, but I really do have an appreciation for it now and enjoy it. So folks, that's my take on Wildlife, and I'd like to see what you think about it. Oh, and I will tell you this, it's grown on me to the point that I recently got the Wildlife Super Deluxe Archive box set. That's how much I've grown to love this album. All right, so that's it, folks. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Matt Mangles McCartney. I will be back next episode with Red Rose Speedway. I don't know when that will be. Could be a couple of days, could be a few days, could be next week. I don't know yet. But I will be back with the next episode. So take care. Bless you all. Hope you're all doing well. Bye-bye.